We all love animation, a medium that takes a variety of forms that have all developed over the last 300 years. From the earliest magic lanterns, to moving pictures, to the modern era, I would argue that no medium affects its animation in the way that video games do. In this essay, we'll be looking at what makes video game animation so unique to other animation, and the extent to which the 12 principles rule set should be expanded upon to accommodate video games, supported by interviews with video game animators in the industry. So to start off, we'll be taking a look at the 12 principles of animation. These are squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead and pose to pose, follow through, overlapping action, slow ins and outs, arcs, secondary action, timing, exaggeration, solid drawings, and finally, appeal. So how do these apply to video games? Well, to get a better insight, we spoke to Santiago Solarte, an animator working at Epic Games.
What's your view on Disney's 12 animation principles?
I think they are more relevant every day because, like before, like maybe we were not able to do this squash and stretch too much, systems to opt in overlapping ideas that could be more rigid. Like the principles are not about it's not about how you implement them in the animation or like in the characters, but actually how you can implement them in the systems that you're creating in games. That's the big difference between games and film. Because games are very tied up with systems. Ideally, way of working that is very much having a lot of anticipation and a lot of overshooting in the end of their system. So, for example, they have long idles. They have slow reactions, or they have timings that you could play a lot with animation. But compared with other games like say like Call of Duty or like more interaction when you need to click the mouse or the gamepad, you need a reaction. Then you will need to think about how that principles you can use them in the favor of the system. So that's a very important thing to learn about games and how you can make these systems flow in the way that as well create this kind of energy and synergy of the animation and the characters and look engaging, in the gameplay.
So the main point to take away here is that animation within video games must serve the game mechanics and fit within its parameters. When a game's animation hinders its own mechanics and systems, it'll be unsatisfying to the player.
I would agree that it is very different, and it's equally very important and separate from animation. The communication that the game gives to the player, animation is just one part of that. The other senses, obviously sound and the tactile response from the controller, all of these things put together kind of delivers the feel of the game. It goes very much to things like how fast the player moves. If the player jumps, how high do they jump? How quickly do they fall? Are those game events communicated to the player? So everything comes back to the core of communicating things to the player and making them feel more in control, following the button press, seeing what the game does, and then that loop going back to the player, into the player's brain, to make them feel and have an understanding of the reality that they're playing and controlling.
Feel, or responsiveness, defines good video game animation. When looking at the medium of animation, animation has been able to make the audience feel emotions, but never before, to this extent in my opinion, has animation been able to make the audience feel in control. Feeling in control is the defining part of video game animation. When the player presses a button, the resulting character animation must feel responsive to the player. This responsiveness is defined by how long the animation lasts after the player presses the button.
We're not just talking about the feel of the player character, but the interaction between those characters.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's always on games, the gameplay is going to overrule everything. Like always, like you always want to have the gameplay to be the one driving design, the one the drives animation. Like the gameplay will have to be the driving force of most of the departments.
So would you say its gameplay is king?
Yes, gameplay is king, exactly.
So the dynamics of a character's animation, and the response time from the input of the player to the animation's endpoint, varies from game to game, and from moment to moment. Communication of the video game animation to the player is crucial within a video game, and this is because the audience needs to feel in control. The player controls many visual aspects of what goes on screen. They control the camera in a third-person game, the position of a character on screen, and the sequence of what animations appear on screen and when. When the camera can move around the character, their animations must be readable and clear from every single angle. When the player strings together a series of actions for a character to do, each different animation must fluidly blend into the next, and in any order depending on which ones the player presses. This is all to do with interactivity. Interactivity and control is what sets the video game medium apart from other mediums, and this interactivity and control changes the way animation is designed. When we were researching the prime differences between video game animation and other mediums, we came across a book by Jonathan Cooper, which became important in our research. Jonathan Cooper is an industry veteran, now living and working in the US. His book, Gameanim, Video Game Animation Explained, now in its second edition, explores the relationship games have to Disney's 12 principles of animation. But more importantly, he codifies a new set of fundamentals, unique to video games. A new set of 5 animation principles.
If you can give a brief overview of yourself, a little bit of your history and your relationship to games.
Sure. I mean, my relationship to games has always been there. Like, I've always played games, and I was fortunate to be born in Dundee, Scotland, where there was that's where Grand Theft Auto started and everything. And so I always was able to go up to the studio when I was in high school and things. And I worked in Scotland for 4 years before coming out to Canada. Got a job, it was small games beforehand, and then I just went straight into AAA games and big ones. My first one was Mass Effect, and that was very fortunate. It's become a classic since then, you know.
Love that
and
series.
I've just moved around, you know. I moved around to Montreal as well, did some games there, Assassin's Creed, and then down to Naughty Dog in California for Uncharted and The Last of Us.
Which Uncharted was that?
Uncharted 4, and then we did The Lost Legacy in a year afterwards as well. So 2
Wow,
games.
that's really short space of time, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've released a book called Gameanim, which I've got here, second edition. I'm still getting through the latter half of it. We've been focused on the relationship of the 12 animation principles that you say in your book aren't really enough for games. But you set out 5 additional principles, I guess, for games animation. Can you talk about those a little?
Sure, if I can remember them. I mean, that's the main thing, is the 12 were super important, and they're not going away anytime soon. But they were made back in the 80s. They were written down back in the 80s. They were formed over decades of experience with cartoon animation. And so that was Disney just looking at their linear productions, their linear medium. And so I didn't come up with these just off the top of my head. There's a lot of chats with people, but then I did a lot of things online as well. I have a bigger Twitter following, so I could ask questions there, and basically came up with essentially 15 new points that are worth talking about. And everyone had the same points, but they weren't they're different names, you know, because we don't have standardization. And I figured you could boil them down into 5 fundamentals, and they're all to do with the interactivity of the medium, and that's what's different. So it's not just about making it pretty, or not just about, you know, telling a story. It's also about you've got game feel, which is something it's on the design side as well. You want to feel your character's responses, so you've got to have the feel. You've got to have fluidity as well, because we don't just play one animation and that's it. You know, you're always playing multiple animations at the same time and then transitioning between them. So that's another really important aspect of it. Just these are new points that I think complement the previous ones, and some of the previous ones, if you've read in my book as well, previous ones actually can be looked at differently and within a lens of video games. They're still relevant, but they kind of mean different things. Like staging, for example, in traditional in the traditional principles is all about whatever you see on screen has to be easily understood, where staging in games is a lot to do with level design and working with the level designer so that things will be placed in a certain way so that you'll easily understand it as you're playing through. And that's something that I've had to consider a lot when working on interactive cutscenes. That's what I've done quite a fair bit in recent years. And you have to have everything set up so you know what's happening when it's happening, but you're still playing through it. So yeah.
In his book, Jonathan lays out the 5 new principles of animation. We've talked about feel, but there's also fluidity, to seamlessly blend together multiple animation cycles. Readability, to ensure the character's animation is readable from every single angle of the camera and direction of the character. Context, to ensure that the character's animation stands out from and functions in the environment the player puts them in. Elegance, to be efficient and effective with how the character animates. Now, feel, we have argued, is one of the most important aspects in the design of video game animation. It certainly feels that way to us and to the others that we interviewed. But we spoke to Jonathan about this to get a better insight into feel and how important this aspect is relative to the other aspects that have been laid out.
It depends on the game. Like there are games where if there's like feel basically boils down to when I make an interaction, you know, like how fast, what do I see on screen? How fast does it occur? And there are games like designers will tell you that it's always the most important thing and you should always like do everything instantaneously. Like Nintendo goes that route where everything is like I press the button and the character's doing it like the next frame, you know, immediately. But I also argue that it's not always the case because now we have the games like the Souls games series and games like Monster Hunter where yes, I press it and I instantly see my character like pull up their mighty axe or sword, but they don't hit them immediately because I'm trying to show that it's a really heavy sword, and so the gameplay is about timing and that kind of thing. And feels different depending on if it's a player character, we want more instant responses there, whereas if it's a non-player character, it needs a bigger wind up on animation because you need to be able to see the attack coming, that type of thing. So it depends on that. And I would also say that we have some huge games like Rockstar's games, which their feel is not the most important thing. Their thing is like the world building, and so their characters have to be a bit more realistic, so they're not like just jumping around on a button press like a Nintendo game. They're quite slow and sluggish, and Red Dead Redemption 2 really went all the way in and deliberately made everything super slow because it's more like a simulation of your being a realistic cowboy. It's not about like I'm just like shooting everything and like a superhero. So I think it all depends on the game, and I always argue that some of the most successful games don't have that kind of Nintendo feedback. So it's not just always the fact that you have to have super speedy reactions. Feel, sometimes you want a slower feel and a more realistic, heavy feel as well.
Now we come back to the question. How do the 12 principles of animation relate to video games? Well, of course, the 12 principles are still heavily important in video game animation. Throughout our research, nobody disagreed. But it's important to note that they are viewed differently, through the lens of the video game's mechanics. And the unique element of control and interactivity leads to the importance of extra rules, summarised in Jonathan Cooper's 5 principles of video game animation. Video game animation is definitely unique to other mediums of animation. It takes what we already know and adds a whole new dimension to it. So are Disney's 12 principles still relevant? Absolutely. But is video game animation unique and requires a whole new perspective on how the audience is involved? Also yes. Thank you to everyone for watching. We hope this was as interesting to you as it was to us making it. To watch the full, raw, unedited interviews with Santiago Salate, Ashley Gwinnell, and Jonathan Cooper, check out the supplementary materials.